call us to order.
I don't think it's on. Can you guys turn it on?
Is the microphone on? Yeah.
It's good. It should be good.
Okay, we're on, it looks like. Good morning. I'm Susan Glasser from The New Yorker, and this is the lightning round version of the Aspen Security Forum. I'm delighted, in fact, to be here for a special conversation about her new book and many other things besides with Farah Pandith, who has the advantage of having served as a political appointee for both President Bush and President Obama at the State Department. And we're going to talk a little bit this morning about her new book, which I highly recommend to you, How We Win, How Cutting-Edge Entrepreneurs, Political Visionaries, Enlightened Business Leaders, not the unenlightened kind, and social media mavens can defeat the extremist threat. Farah, thank you so much for joining us this morning. So I have to say, we had a little preview of this in our dinner table conversation last night, and I think we have to start out not with the book, but really with the sea change that has sort of occurred since you started writing this book, which was meant to be an account, and is a fascinating account of your experiences in trying to think about how the United States could act globally to challenge the rising threat of extremism. There's sort of an elephant in the room, right, isn't there, in terms of what's happened since then. You were telling me about what it's like to be a woman of color traveling around the United States in 2019 talking about this book.
Well, first of all, I couldn't have imagined as I began this book that I would even have to be talking about the far right and the rise of white nationalists. It didn't even enter my mind. What I was thinking about are the next armies of ISIS, the next armies of Al-Qaeda. This book tour has been really enlightening for me. I grew up outside of Boston. I'm an American. I'm obviously somebody who understands our country, but in the last few jobs that I've had, my job has been to serve our nation overseas, so I wasn't ready to be in rooms where people were saying things to me like, "You speak English really well." I said, "Thank you." Or how did they let you serve in the White House and at the Department of State when you're not an American? And, it's stunning. It's stunning for so many reasons, for all of us. This isn't about being Muslim or being somebody who doesn't have white skin or doesn't have the purest blood, whatever that might mean. This is about what's happened to our country and what's happened to the world. So yes, there has been a rise of extremism, and we have to talk about it. But while we pay attention, and we must pay attention to the rise of the far right, and the white nationalists, and the neo-Nazis, and the sovereign citizens, ISIS is still recruiting. And that's the message here. We have been lazy on all of this. America has been asleep at the wheel, looking at this issue like it's something that we have defeated and it's gone. Meanwhile, ISIS is still recruiting at pace. They are entrepreneurial, and we are not. They are focused on a demographic that is 1 billion Muslims strong, and that frightens me.
Well, so, there's so much to unpack here, right? Because we're really talking about the not parallel but intersecting national security conversations. It's not that the old post 9/11 conversation about rising extremism around the world or the threat from global jihadism, it's not that conversation has ended. It's that it has been intersected with a whole new conversation here inside the United States, one which we're not really equipped to have in terms of national security. So let's talk about your original intent in trying to share your own experiences of what it was like to be at the State Department and trying and not always succeeding in addressing this. What is the effect right now of the United States looking inward and not paying attention to ISIS?
The lack of American leadership on this threat is very dangerous, and it's going to make a difference for us in the long term. It's going to cost us more in the long term, because the bottom line for how people recruit is that these young people are dealing with a crisis of identity. And that crisis of identity appears in a lot of different ways, and some of you will feel that even in the way our nation feels right now. We're asking ourselves questions about who we are as Americans, aren't we? And what it feels like, and what we really stand for. Those young Muslims are asking those very same questions in a post 9/11 world, but the numbers are huge. And it isn't. America has looked at this issue from a regional perspective. what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in Pakistan, what might be happening in Northern Africa. I'm here to say to you, in what I saw traveling to nearly 100 countries around the world, it was shocking for me to see that a Muslim living in a Muslim majority country, as well as a Muslim living as a minority in that demographic of millennials, we're all having a crisis of identity. That has to be part of our strategy. So when America isn't looking at the real threat, that we aren't understanding the system that is underlying extremism, and only sort of playing whack-a-mole, we have the problem that we have today, which is the bad guys are continuing to recruit. We are continuing to see an interest in the us versus them ideology. And the scary thing too, Susan, is that we have lost our imagination of what could come. So when we were thinking about AQ, we could not possibly have thought there would be an ISIS. Today, you might say, well, Farah, you might be looking at ISIS 2.0. I'm looking at the next dimension of who they're going to recruit, not just millennials, but Generation Z. And by the way, obviously not just men, but the all-women armies that are to come. So for me, how America leads, how it thinks about things, is critical to all of this.
The all-women armies to come, it seems like the topic of a panel in its own right, which Ambassador Burns, I'm hoping you put on for next year. I can't wait to have that conversation. But let me ask you, you talked about recruiting. When you see something like thousands of people in a North Carolina arena saying, send her back to an American Muslim woman, what is the effect of that in the world of the internet and in the world of social media today? Does that exist outside of a domestic American political context? What is the national security implication of that?
So my argument is that there's no domestic and international with millennials. I mean, obviously with a swish of their finger, they're connected around the world. What's happening in Nouakchott, Mauritania matters to what's happening in Milan, what happens in another part of the world. If you segment the offline, you are missing the point. What we see is the rise of us versus them, in whatever form it comes. The bad guys, the kinds of bad guys that I've been working on, will take anything that we do in our country and utilize it to say, we told you all along that being Muslim means that you can't be American, or that the West is against Islam, or there's only one way to be a Muslim and we're going to show you how to do it. And so our conversations here matter. I tell a story in this book about being in the jungles of Cambodia, sitting on the floor of a very modest mosque, talking to women and young people about being Muslim in Cambodia. And somebody raised their hand and through the translator asked me whether or not, and I'm not going to say his name, but this person, blank, represented America. And I'm going to ask you if you can remember the name of the pastor in Gainesville, Florida. Do you remember him? The guy who was going to burn a Quran? You've forgotten him because he doesn't represent America. But that person in the jungles of Cambodia named him by name, Terry Jones. And so what we see here, what we see here happening in America about sending her home, you don't belong, you'll never be, you can't be a Jew or a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Muslim in this country, and that you can't go to your houses of worship because you're afraid to go pray, that every house in America of worship has police around them because we're afraid of what might happen. Those messages get sent around the world, Susan, and it's dangerous for us.
Let me flip it around because we don't have that much time. What about the stories that we're not paying attention to because, in fact, we're so inward looking in our politics at the moment? We didn't necessarily expect a civil war in Syria before it broke out. We didn't expect an ISIS to be the successor to al-Qaeda. So what is it that you're tracking right now that is forced out of our conversation by the tweets and the distractions?
Well, the larger trends, America has been really bad at understanding the cultural listening component of what is happening in the world. Corporates do this really well. They can explain to you, they have people in their companies that are edge dwellers. They can look forward and see the trends that are happening with millennials. There's nobody in government that does that. We don't adapt ourselves in that way, and that's dangerous for us because the cultural component are the canaries in the coal mine. You see what's happening. You don't want the crisis when it's already exploded. You want to see the change of sentiment of these young kids as they progress through their adolescence. The human brain doesn't develop until the age of 24. And for a young person, that identity exploration is important for us to get our hands around. And so what we're missing are the little changes that Americans in the policy world tend to think, oh, that's happening over here, or yeah, that might be happening over there, but we're not connecting the dots. What do I mean on the crisis of identity? They are changing the way, Muslim youth are changing the way they speak, they eat, they talk, they dress. And you may say, as the US government, what is that? It's not our problem. But it is a problem. Because if you only adapt Islam as a monolith, we have a problem. The bad guys want you to believe that there's only one way of being Muslim. And we haven't been watching that. And let me just say one other thing. I talked about the identity being a really important part of the system that is underlying extremism. The other plank that goes right by it is the role of Saudi Arabia. They have been a bully. They continue to be a bully. They've literally gotten away with murder. But what you're not watching in the policy circles, and what we're not doing today, is understanding that for 3 to 4 decades, that soft stuff that panel just before us was talking about, the soft infiltration that is happening in communities to make them feel differently, to make them feel like the heritage that they've had for 800 years means nothing, and that they need to Arabize and Saudiize how they are. That's going to come back to bite us. And it's going to cost us in treasure and in lives.
You make so many interesting points, but I have to say, looking at your book the other day, it almost had this feeling of being a cry from a different moment in time, one that we remember. I mean, it's a recent moment in time when we were immersed in, what was then called the global war on terror. But it does feel like a different era. And you have a lot of specific policy prescriptions and recommendations. But I have to ask you, is any of this in the least bit realistic in even the short to medium term here in the United States, given where we are? I mean, we're not going to be doing any of these things. Not only are we not going to be dealing with Saudi Arabia, we seem to have doubled down in our alliance with them.
Well, look, I'm very clear, and I've been very clear about a couple of things. Since 9/11, the government has worked really hard to defend ourselves, and we have a lot to be proud of, obviously. But in the soft power space, we have not. We have not matched our effort in the kinetic war with the efforts in the non-kinetic war. I don't see President Trump and this administration changing that. Soft power is not something that they have explored. But I said when I started writing this book, and the answer here, the book is called How We Win, not because I think we're never going to win, but because I'm a realist and I'm a practical person. The all-in effort isn't just about government. Government isn't the only solution. Corporates have to take a role in understanding the rise of hate, the rise of us versus them. And we are beginning to see a shift in that. So when you ask that question, I'd say, correct, I agree with you. In the short term, the Trump administration has pulled the money from all the ideological efforts. There's not an organized effort domestically or internationally on making sure that the appeal of us versus them is not going forward. We're doing barely anything in terms of scaling all of the things that we have marketized. So we have solutions at our fingertips that this administration could do right now and just scale it without creating anything new that we haven't. So where I'm looking, not just for the next administration, we're not going to sit back and watch while ISIS continues to recruit, and Al-Qaeda, Hamza bin Laden, by the way, is a millennial. He's a digital native. He's out there. He's a credible face for his generation. So AQ, ISIS, and whatever comes next, I'm looking to civil society, and I'm looking to the corporates to say, you have a role to play here in fighting hate.
Well, it's interesting, just to underscore your point, these solutions that you talk about, and it's interesting because we're in a moment where we don't talk a lot about solutions. These were essentially not particularly partisan or controversial in the past, right? These were things that both the Bush administration and the Obama administration agreed upon?
Absolutely.
So why have they fallen by the wayside?
Well, President Trump didn't come in here saying we want to defeat the ideology of us versus them. And in fact, he's added a spark to it. In the very first days of him becoming president, the Muslim ban, all of the stuff that comes after it. So it isn't as if there is a cognition, that in fact there's a role that we can play and we can actually turn the dial down. In fact, the dial has been turned up, and it is going to require, because there is no U.S. leadership in soft power, in stopping the appeal of this ideology, I will look to our partners and allies in other parts of the world to say, what can you be doing while we are not leading, while we are sitting back and are asleep at the wheel?
Thank you for letting us be a stop on your book tour.
Thanks.
Thank all of you for listening. It's hard to go before lunch, but I think that's what we're up to. This is great.